into who I am and what I do and how I come into all this here in a moment. But first, I want to open with a story, a legend. Where I come from in western North Carolina, it's the home of the Cherokee Indians. It's a beautiful landscape. You're going to see in the lecture we're about to give here on giant skeletons some of the landscape and why I love where I live so much. And what's so fascinating to me about this area is that the mythological history of the Cherokees involves a lot of what we could only call inhuman beings. They're little people. They're spirit folk. And the one thing you don't find a whole lot of, interestingly, are giants. However, there is one legend, and we're going to dig into it a little more deeply here. This was kind of the impetus for my interest in this subject, was this one legend. And it was carried over to the anthropologist James Mooney by a man in the early 1800s. And he, of course, being of Cherokee descent, had said that one of his ancestors had told him about this strange being. In fact, there was an entire group of beings, slant-eyed giants. They were known as the giants from the West. They came, they spent time with the Cherokee, and then they left and went back to the West where they had come from. Now this is one of two legends that include also the Cherokee god of the hunt that involve giants. And what's interesting about this, and the curious lack of reports of giants in that history, is that unlike a lot of the other spirit beings, I found it very interesting that there's only one reference to a group of large beings that came and spent time with the Cherokee and then left. Now people say, of course, oh, that's just a folk tale. It's just a mythic tradition. There's no way that we can base any factual evidence that we have access to today on this, and that we can substantiate this as being more than just a legend. Or is there? Now, something else that we're going to be looking at throughout the course of this lecture is something that David and I and Dr. Schock and I, and you, we've all kind of had esoteric jam sessions, as we like to say. I'm a musician, and so improvisation is part of what we do. But we talk a lot about this debate between belief and skepticism. We're going to get into a lot of skepticism with this. There are people who call me a skeptic. There are people who say that I'm so open-minded my brain might fall out of my head. I like to think I'm somewhere in the middle. And frankly, I think that there's both room for skepticism and also room for open-mindedness in this debate. And what more modern skeptics are going to try and tell you is there's nothing to what you're about to see here. I stand in favor of the contrary position, that there is something to this, and that in fact, I think that we have to be open-minded in what we look at. We also have to be discerning just as well. I do think that there are giant skeletons, and we'll look at why. And we're going to look at some of these mythic traditions as well, and perhaps how the modern evidence that we have access to, maybe more so now than ever, can help substantiate some of these legends. This, of course, being one of these famous, and you're going to see throughout the lecture a lot of these famous newspaper articles that, again, the modern skeptic would probably say, oh, those are all newspaper hoaxes. We know, of course, David and I especially, that all those old newspaper reports from back in the 1800s, they were all hoaxes. Those people, these newspapermen would write anything just to try and, make up a story. Maybe that's just not quite the case, and I think we'll see as we progress here today that there indeed maybe is a little more to it. Now, I'm Micah Hanks, and as I've told you, I live in western North Carolina. This is one of many, that's me. Can you see me up there? This is one of many reasons why I love western North Carolina. This is, of course, a sheer cliff, and that, God, it's probably a several thousand-foot drop that goes way down into this ravine between this cliff face and what's called Table Rock in the Linville Gorge. Table Rock, of course, is one of the many locations where a famous earthlight phenomenon, or maybe if we were to apply a more modern scientific term to it, earthquake lights is what they're supposed to be. But this is the side of the Brown Mountain Lights phenomenon. It's been long discussed in a lot of esoteric literature. I've been fascinated with that. And, of course, Table Rock was also known as the mystic altar of the Cherokee people. And I spent a lot of time up there, and I'm telling you, when you go to the top of a cliff and look down on the world, you feel like you're a bird flying. It's hard not to get a mystical sensation almost when you experience places like this in nature. It's truly beautiful. And then when I'm not out there in the wilds of remote portions of the Americas, I'm at home doing this, writing about these kinds of things. And of course, reading these fantastic old fate magazines and things like that. I've recently been made a consulting editor to Fate magazine, which is a real blessing, because I think a lot of us as researchers probably, if we didn't get our start writing for magazines like Fate, we've certainly learned a lot from reading them over the years. So this is the other thing that we do, and I think that that's what's so interesting about researchers in this field, is that we get to kind of juxtapose this adventure lifestyle versus staring at what we collectively might call the one-eyed retina-burning monster known as the laptop computer screen. So it's really hard on your eyes sometimes. This is Iseo, the river of many cliffs. The Limble River, which flows down. Table Rock is just across the ridge over there. This was another ancient Cherokee site. They believed that this river held incredible mystic power, and also, of course, it was used for ritual killings in ancient times. The story is that this is overlooking Limble Falls, and if you were standing looking at this, the water flows down around you, and then there's a huge drop right there. And it was said that if you weren't scalped often, the Cherokee would actually take people and they would send them off this waterfall and they would plummet to their death. Iseo, the river of many cliffs. So amidst all these fascinating Cherokee legends, oh, and one more thing also I'll show. This is another clip that I found. Petroglyphs kind of tie into this mythology as we're about to see. I'm going to show you one of my favorite ancient petroglyph sites in western North Carolina and what this has to do with the tradition of giants in this region. On this cliff face, when you're digging around, often you find a lot of these things. And part of what I like to try and do when I'm looking for ancient sites is I like to try and find and document petroglyph finds throughout not just western North Carolina, but anywhere else that I travel to. A lot of them are documented, some of them are not. And on this location, which is located actually a little town called Girton, western North Carolina, I found this petroglyph. Now this looks more modern, but what's significant about this one, just as an example of the petroglyphs that I found, is that while this looks like a T, it could also be interpreted as a cross. And Scott Walter, a colleague of mine who has a program on history channel called America Unearthed, has said this resembles somewhat what he calls a hooked X, which he believes may be evidence of course, not Templars, Masons coming to the Americas, possibly much earlier than modern historians would suspect that they had actually been here. This is a very difficult location to get to. I had to climb sheer to the top of a mountain. As far as I know, I don't think that this is a documented petroglyph in western North Carolina, so your eyes may be some of the first that actually see this. Now, for all I know, it also could just be Tom Zabuba, who carved his initials there in the rock. Of course, they look very old, and that's what caught my eye about them. I notified Scott and Janet, his wife, about this, and unfortunately they said that it would be very difficult to get a film crew down to climb to the top of that mountain and to take a look at this. And so the best I might be able to do is present an etching and, of course, put my hand up there for comparison. I'll remember to get a manicure next time. Okay. Now, when it comes to these petroglyph sites, I just showed you a slightly more esoteric petroglyph. Nobody probably knows about that last one. This one is very well known. This is called Judaculla Rock. It's located in a little area near Cullowhee, North Carolina. There's a university there as well. This is a very ancient soapstone boulder. It's very large. I would say it's probably maybe half the size of that wall. And Judaculla Rock, it's one of the famous sites in western North Carolina. Years and years ago, there was a serious concern that Judaculla Rock may actually be sinking into the ground. It was becoming covered with mud. And you can actually see here there's this darker upper portion of the rock, and then this lighter lower portion. That actually is the portion that for the last probably 100 years or so had not been exposed. During my most recent visit to Judaculla Rock, I had a couple of friends formerly that worked with Bell Laboratories from Pennsylvania. They came down, they wanted to see it. I took them out there, and I was very pleased to see that there has actually been a recent excavation where they have removed the earth and exposed more of Judaculla Rock. On the opposite side coming around, you can also see portions. This is what the Cherokee had actually used Judaculla Rock for. In addition to all these markings, you can see these petroglyphs. Some have supposed that this is a map and that these are perhaps remnants of an ancient language, or possibly these are pictorial references to different kinds of animals and things like that. I think it may be a combination of all these sorts of things. Also, as you can see, they would remove portions of the stone so that they could create bowls. These impressions are where the beginnings of bowls were being made, and they would carve these portions out and scrape down and make kind of like a stone kind of bowl. This is something that the Cherokee were known to do. But what's truly fascinating about this is that the stone is believed to be Cherokee in origin. In other words, they are believed to have been the ones that made the carvings. Nobody really is certain if Judaculla Rock was carved by the Cherokee who moved into the region. Some estimates, there have been, and I can't source this was only told to me by a person with the division of I'm trying to remember where she worked for, but she was associated with Western Carolina University in the area. A woman named Kari Yates had told me that there had been a determination by state geologists that had thought that this stone could be much older, possibly 3,000 to 5,000 years, maybe as much as 10,000 years old. The etchings are still visible, but obviously there's been a lot of wear over the ages. As the This weather, of course, has pounded this thing. At one time, it had been kind of an enclosure built over it. That's not the case today, and it's very exposed to the elements. Now, why this is interesting to me and what this has to do with giants, this is where things start getting really interesting. Judaculla rock, I have to say, is kind of a bastardized term. Judaculla is we could call an anglicized, I suppose, version of the older Cherokee word Sukalu. Okay, Sukalu was the Cherokee god of the hunt. He was, get this, a slant-eyed giant, much like the giants that we heard about earlier that supposedly visited from the west. Sukalu. This is a interpretation, an artistic rendering of the Cherokee god of the hunt, Sukalu. Now, please don't confuse him with Sukalos. Giorgio may resemble a giant at times, but it's just because of the way that the hair stands up off of the head. It gives the impression of more height than there's, I think Giorgio's probably about our height, don't you? So, just remember, Sukalus, Sukalos, Sukalu, different. Coming back to Judaculla rock, now this is probably one of the more prominent of the petroglyphs found on Judaculla rock. And what this is actually said to represent is the six-fingered hand of Sukalu, or Judaculla. The legend about the Caney Fork Valley where Judaculla rock rests is that Sukalu, the god of the hunt, who lived high on top of one of the adjacent ridges, leapt from the top of the mountain and landed down in the Caney Fork Valley. And where he landed, he steadied himself as he landed, and his handprint, they say, was left there on the massive stone boulder, which is named for him today. And that is supposedly the six-fingered hand of Judaculla. Now, I don't know if that's really a handprint. Probably not. You'd have to have a tremendous amount of force, and I'm no physicist, but I think it would take a lot to actually lodge a handprint into the side of Judaculla rock, and that's about maybe actual size. I postulate rather than being a handprint, it's probably a squid. Then again, we're at sea, and maybe I just have, sea creatures on my mind. Now, what's fascinating about this, of course, and is we're beginning to see there is this mythology, and this is one of only two instances, and I want to return again to the story of the giants from the west. This is one of two instances where in the Cherokee tradition there were references to giants. Both of them describe large people with slanted eyes. Very interesting. James Wofford was the man who told this story. He was of the Western Cherokee, and this is actually excerpted from a book called Myths of the Cherokee by James Mooney. He was born in Georgia in 1806, and he said that his grandmother, who must have been born about the middle of the last century, told him that she had heard from the old people, long before her time, of a party of giants that had come once to visit the Cherokee. They were nearly twice as tall as common men, according to what Wofford said. They had eyes set slanting in their heads so that the Cherokee called them Sunilkalu, the slant-eyed people, because they looked like the giant hunter Sukalu. They said that these giants lived very far away in the direction in which the sun goes down. The Cherokee received them as friends, and they stayed for some time and then returned to their home in the west. The story, according to Mooney, was possibly a distorted historical tradition. That was his interpretation of that. So I'm fascinated with this story because, again, unlike a lot of the traditions that are kind of consistent, and there are multiple instances of stories of, for instance, the Cherokee Little People, which are interpreted as being spirit folk. The Cherokee referred to these giants in this legend that Wofford told as being, well, very large people that actually came, stayed with the Cherokee, and then left. Didn't seem to be anything spiritual about them, although interpretations of Sukalu in the legends are much more of a spirit type person. Thanks you. He was someone who could kind of come and go as he pleased. He could disappear if he had to. And he had mystical powers. This was not asserted, but then again, this reference to the giants of the West is the only such story, and so it doesn't give us a whole lot to go off of. But I've often wondered about this story of giants that came from lands located to the west. Even Sukalu was said to live off to the west toward the direction of Tennessee relative to the western North Carolinas where the Cherokee are and where the reservation, of course, is today. Now, this isn't a cave in the western North Carolinas. I do happen to do a little bit of spelunking when I'm out and about doing these sorts of things. This is, of course, the famous Lovelock Cave. This is a cave that is located much further west from where the Cherokee are. But, of course, the famous story of the Lovelock Cave was that I believe in 1911, it was 1911 that the excavations began. It started as a guano mining operation. And then the guano miners go in there. Everyone knows what guano is, right? Okay, good. We don't have to, yeah. They go into the cave, they're removing guano. There were apparently several feet of guano that had collected on the floor of the cave over the years. as they began to remove guano from the base of the cave, they began to find skeletons. Some of these skeletons are very large, some of them possibly taller than 6.5 feet. This is one of the skulls that had been on display in this. David Childress had corrected me. This was not in a private museum. This was in, I believe, a state-maintained museum.
Yeah, county museum.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about this is that the story that is associated with the Lovelock giants is rather odd. It's very convoluted. One interpretation involves a race of giants, a mythical race known as the Siteka. And the Siteka were said to be very tall. They were said to be cannibalistic, and they were also said to have red hair. Very strange. Don't sound very much like Native Americans. In fact, Native American traditions in that area also maintain that they had been warring with the other tribes, and that these giants had been chased into the Lovelock Cave where they had set a fire, and they basically were killed in this fashion. Now, what is interesting is that, as I understand, archaeologists have managed to determine that there is some evidence of cannibalism with some of the bones that were recovered from Lovelock Cave, and that what it appears is that there are split bones where marrow may have been extracted, but of course the modern interpretation of this is that this would have been done in order to remove the marrow, possibly during a famine period. These people were desperate and they were probably eating their own dead, is what people say, but it's fascinating that the native traditions hold that no, these people were cannibals, and this is actually what they did. Now, with regard to the red hair, this is kind of a strange thing just as well, because there are a couple ways that we might interpret this. It is known, and I do want to point out that with the recovery of a lot of the bog mummies and things like this, people have said that they will often find red-haired bog mummies as well. This is something that is due to the loss of pigmentation over time, as a result of how these mummies are actually preserved. With the Lovelock giants, people said that this looked more like actual red hair. In fact, there's supposedly still a ceremonial garb or a dress of some variety that one popular author, and her name's slipping my mind at the moment, but she says that she actually has a garb that has some of this red hair contained with it. So it's kind of an interesting story. But what it seems to sound like to many researchers is that we were dealing with what possibly were more Caucasian-looking beings that were there at the Lovelock Cave. Of course, this is one of many instances where we do still have some remnants of the bodies that were recovered. But one of the strangest stories about the Lovelock giants is that, of course, as these guano miners go into this cave and they're trying to retrieve all these bodies and these artifacts, among which possibly this helps substantiate the idea that these were people of very large stature, is the fact that there were sandal-like footwear that were found to be about 15 inches long. That's pretty big. It's a pretty big foot. One of the stories had been that there was a local fraternity and that one of the larger of the skeletons was handed over to them, and it was subsequently boiled as part of an initiation ritual. So, of course, we have these fantastic relics, and they're handed over to a fraternity that boils them down and does God knows what. I don't want to know what they did with them, but, But the story of the Lovelock giants is a fascinating one. Of course, we find in a lot of the reports of alleged giant skeletons recovered, especially during the 1800s, early 1900s, that we have a lot of different things that tend to appear. We see this reference to reddish hair, of course, from the Lovelock giants. We also hear about double rows of teeth. This was something that also sounded very strange to me, the idea of double rows of teeth. It's actually not all that uncommon. An associate of mine, Jim Vieira, anyone here familiar with Jim Vieira by chance? Yes, I think you and Jim worked together some, but as well as another gentleman that we'll be referencing here in a few minutes. Jim had contacted me a while back. He's probably one of the modern researchers today who's done the most in terms of collecting these kinds of reports of giant skeletons. Jim Vieira's story is a strange one as well. I don't think he got into this initially saying, I'm looking for anomalies. He kept stumbling on. He'd been researching dolmens and things throughout the Americas, large stone structures, and he had begun to come across these reports of giant skeletons, became very intrigued by them. Jim Vieira also gave a TEDx presentation on this that I think last year or the year before when it first appeared had been one of the most watched TEDx presentations of that year. Guess what happened to it, by the way? Anyone want to guess? The presentation was taken off the internet. Yeah, apparently it's not, again, something that you're supposed to talk about. So I had Jim on my radio program. I do a radio program on Sunday nights, streaming live on the internet, and then also 2 podcasts. And I had Jim on my program, and I said, so what happened? Why did the presentation get taken down? And he says, listen, I'm telling you, I've encountered the exact same problem that so many others do when they try to talk about this. You bring this discussion, okay, to an academic audience. They may find it fascinating, but it's not something that is up to the standards of modern science to even discuss this and assert that there are large giants. Now, I think that probably one reason for this is because that many writers say, well, they are a separate race of giants. These things are something that I think, again, the modern skeptic would interpret as being something apart from human, and hence they reject that idea. Well, let's assume we're talking about humans of large stature. Obviously, humans of large stature have existed. They do exist today, often as a result of pituitary gland issues, such as a tumor that can cause the release of growth hormones and things like this. We also look at the fossil record, and as we'll see a little later, there are a number of large hominids that have existed in our ancient past. Archaeologists, anthropologists can acknowledge this, and we can see that physically, in terms of life that can exist on planet Earth, this is not something beyond the realm of the possible. These things can and have existed, and yet when we look at these reports of giants that have been unearthed through parts of not just the Americas but other parts of the world, as we'll see a little later, systematically that idea is ignored, and people seem to be dissuaded from talking about it. Many would try and say that that's a bold argument to make, but again, I ask, why would Jim Vieira present and he was very rational, and he tried to be very unbiased about the presentation that he gave. I think you can still find it someplace online, but systematically, people are dissuaded from talking about this. Why? Is it because the presentation of the idea that there were people of large stature is something that is inconsistent with our understanding of modern anthropology and the history of the human species, and therefore, if it isn't according to the conventions of modern academic knowledge and consensus opinions, that it is something that we should never interpret as being even possible? I don't know. I think that what we're going to see, and I told you we were going to talk a little bit about skepticism versus belief. I can be very critical of people of the skeptical disposition these days, despite trying to be a very skeptical researcher myself, and I think the reason why is because at what point when you are skeptical, A, do you have to silence the opinions of others? And it's one thing if someone's talking about pure quackery. I understand some things are absolutely bizarre, and there's a lot of bizarre stuff you'll hear about in this field. But the other thing, too, is that if a person's beliefs differ from your own, is there ever a time where it's helpful to be rude and dismissive and condescending about this? Dr. Schock and I were talking last night about a speaker that had appeared at an event that I hold each year called the Paradigm Symposium. He's an arch skeptic by the name of P.Z. Myers. And our experience with P.Z., of course, had been that this man is just one of the most snarky individuals. And I'm not trying to attack him here, but I'll have to say that he does attack a lot of other researchers. And if you try to bring this conversation and say, listen, without making any assertions, merely making the observation that the giant skeletons exist. There are very large beings that exist in parts of the world, some of them much larger than large acromegaly would be the term for it in terms of what can cause a growth hormone imbalance, and we see people like Robert Wadlow and whatnot, larger even than some of the largest known people to exist in modern times. Yes, these finds have occurred. Yes, these beings have existed. I'm merely presenting this, I'm making the observation. And again, I notice that folks like our friend PZ will come after you and they'll say, look, that's an absurd claim, let's not talk about this. This is inconsistent with consensus opinion. Why that attitude has to exist, I don't know. But I notice that the researchers in our camp tend to try and be a little bit nicer about it. You're never going to find me, if I'm skeptical or if I'm being open-minded about anything, I'm never going to come after somebody about their beliefs and try and be condescending about it. There's no room for cynicism, and cynicism is skepticism, I should say. There's no room for pure snark, and I call these people snarktics rather than skeptics. So. They are. I can put it more crudely, but you talk with me some of the time. We'll talk about that. Now, coming back to and I do have to pepper this debate because I think it's important, and this is the whole thing. The name of the presentation is Giant Skeletons, a Contentious Debate. It is a contentious debate. But why does it have to be contentious? Why can't we examine the evidence and just say, okay, listen, it may not be in keeping with what we understand, but let's at very least observe and let's try and make sense of what we can observe. And I think that there's good evidence for it. Now, in trying to do so myself, it had been pointed out to me by a fellow researcher of mine that there are certain diseases, as we've come to find, that some of the features of the giant skeletons have been associated with. For instance, we see that both red hair and double rows of teeth have been associated with a disease known as autosomal dominant hyper IgE syndrome. Now, this can include a lot of these symptoms, and I've listed them here: facial asymmetry, a prominent forehead, deep set eyes, broad nasal bridge, wide fleshy nasal tip, prognathism, which is of course the jaw protruding outward, retained primary teeth, and this is, I think, one of the explanations for the double rows of teeth. See, I didn't know that this existed. I couldn't confirm this, but it is said that Andre the Giant, the large wrestler, may have even had 2 rows of teeth. And Jim Vieira was the one that brought it to my attention when he had said that he had been approached at an event that he was giving, where he was giving a lecture about this, he brought up the fact that many of the unearthed skeletons during the 19th century were found to have double rows of teeth like this. And he said a man came out of the audience and approached him and said, I had double rows of teeth. I had 2 rows and I had to have them removed. My baby teeth never fell out. And I literally had 2 rows of teeth in my head. Now, you don't hear stories of 3 or 4 rows of teeth in these giant skulls, like a shark, where one falls out and another one moves in or anything like that. You do sometimes hear reports of very sharp teeth, but the double rows of teeth, again, is something that is in keeping with a known situation, an actual disorder, or rather a condition that some people have been known to have. I had been unaware of that. And so to me, I think that a lot of people, when they look at these reports, they say, my gosh, you're saying that they claim that they unearthed from this mound all these giants with 2 rows of teeth, and they were more than 7 feet tall. This sounds absurd. Well, it's actually in keeping with known situations that have occurred even in modern times. But the other problem, and I think, again, that a skeptical person would bring to this is they would say, well, a person who's 6.5 feet tall, that's not really giant. Dr. Shock is a giant, according to those conventions. I've even gone through, and lovingly too, we love him, by the way. He sticks out in the crowd, and we like that. But when we talk about giants, I've gone through a lot of these reports, and I've dug up a lot of these. And a book I passed along to my friend Hugh here has recently presented probably the most comprehensive and exhaustive collection of these reports from the 19th and early 20th century that deal with giants in newspaper articles and things. And what's very interesting is I decided, being the dork that I am, that I would go through and that I would try and get an average height for most of these skeletons. The average height typically tends to be about 7 foot 1 inch tall. Okay, now anyone who's watched an NBA basketball game knows that, well, again, 7 feet isn't necessarily all that extraordinary. However, what is interesting to me is that while we have cases where certain people were people can be 7 or 8 feet tall, I mean, it's certainly not the norm to be 7 or 8 feet tall. And yet, when we look at a lot of these reports of excavations that have occurred, there are instances where numerous large skeletons appear alongside one another, which we can interpret as being one of 2 things. There have been a lot of them existing in certain areas and at similar times, or when people of large stature came along, they would be buried in the same location. One theory that a friend of mine in NASA had put forth is that, well, maybe some of these beings of large stature, if they were normal humans, they were revered for some reason. I've begun to think maybe the people in the ancient world even looked at a person of very large size as being special, maybe even sacred or something. And I think it's, again, largely evidenced by the totems and the things, the Easter Island statues that we see and we saw in David's lecture. These obviously pay homage to very large people. Now, this is an actual San Antonio Express newspaper clipping where we see comparison between 2 normal skulls and a very large skull here. Again, the assertion that all of these newspaper articles represent hoaxes, I don't think is an argument that washes. And there are 2 problems that have led to this. One is that, of course, we see these nuppaper stories, and it is known that there were a lot of hoaxes that occurred, especially in the 19th century. And therefore, we can't take seriously a lot of these claims of very large skeletons that pop up. That's one alleged viewpoint, I guess, that a more skeptical researcher of today would bring to this argument. I think that the other thing, too, is that so often what we find is that in these instances where large skeletons are removed, the story, and this happens enough to where it is puzzling, maybe even troubling, but the allegation is that the Smithsonian Institute will tend to appear and that they will gather these things, but then after having received the find, it's unable to be located again. And so often people have asserted that it appears that there may be some sort of cover-up or some reason that the Smithsonian may obtain these fossil finds or bone finds if they were actually preserved and buried. They may retrieve these specimens and then for whatever reason they don't have them available publicly for folks. I don't know why that would be the case. I think that there is both there's a strong argument to be made for that, and we'll look at a couple of cases here in a moment. And then also I think that there are times where if we dig a little more deeply, we may be able to find evidence of some of these specimens that the Smithsonian has gone and taken, and then allegedly they've been lost. Some of them I think do still exist, as we're going to see, and I've actually managed to find just a few of them, but that doesn't account for all of them. And so I think that it's a mixture of the 2 scenarios where, yes, there seems to be a strange preponderance of instances where things seem to be lost or misplaced or unacknowledged, And then some of these things actually do exist. And why it's important to acknowledge that they do exist is not to try and remove the idea that, well, maybe there's something funky going on with the Smithsonian. I really don't know. I know that I was introduced to the idea many years ago, again in an article that David wrote, a fantastic article. I think it appeared in Nexus magazine that talked about the Smithsonian cover-up, and it looks at a lot of these cases. It's important to be able to determine, though, that some of these finds do still exist with the Smithsonian because it substantiates the claims of the finds, and therefore, again, it gives us a broader understanding of, well, maybe these reports from yesteryear aren't all hoaxes. Maybe there is indeed truth to them. Now, talking about this specific photograph here, again, it's a little grainy, as a lot of these retrieved from microfilm tend to be, but I do want to point out this is a very large skull, described as being one of the largest ever to exist. It says here, giant skull, believed to be possibly the largest found in the world. The human skull was shown on the right and was recently unearthed in Victoria County by Texas University anthropologists. The other two here are of normal size. Now, what we do begin to see here, we do see prominent cheekbones. We also see, here especially, you can see a spacing between the teeth. This is consistent with a condition today known as acromegaly, which can cause prominent cheekbones, an elongated nose, a jutting jaw, and of course the teeth tend to be displaced. And you'll have that situation where you actually have this spacing that's pretty prevalent. I'm pretty sure that what we're seeing right there, rather than being a separate race of human, I'm pretty sure that we're seeing a human being that was suffering from a growth hormone disorder. Now, this is a very interesting situation with this one. This is a frame that was sent along to me by a colleague. An Indian cemetery in Santa Rosa Island containing abalone shells, radiocarbon dated at 7,070 years. But get this. Tops of the skulls were painted red. Several skeletons measuring over 7 feet tall were all buried together in this site. That's a fantastic photograph right there because, again, it says several skeletons taller than 7 feet buried together in this site. Now, I don't want to make a bold assertion, but I do want to say that it is at least compelling to me that there were several of these large skeletons found in one site together, and then dated to 7,070 years, radiocarbon dated. That's pretty interesting to me. Was that, or is that evidence of people who existed much earlier, who indeed were large? Now, later in the lecture, we're going to look at a few instances where there have been periods of what we might call gigantism, that some of our ancient ancestors or some of our ancient cousins had gone through, especially the Heidelberg man in parts of South Africa, where Hughes spent a lot of time down there, as well as the researcher Michael Tellinger, who was a famous pop singer as well, as I've come to learn. But this is something that anthropologists acknowledge, that indeed there was a period where Heidelberg man had gone through a stage of 7 to 9 feet tall being the norm, the average height. Much larger than your average person today. Again, we see that possibly at Santa Rosa Island, that something similar may have been going on. Largest skull ever recorded. And this is where it starts getting really interesting. Okay, so here we have, this is a report from, I think, 1923. Yeah, 1923. Largest skull ever recorded is discovered by archaeologists in Stafford County. Okay, now 1923, again, we're getting into the 20th century, but so often when you say, look, here's a report, huge skull found in Stafford County. Well, again, a modern skeptical interpretation, and it's justifiable too. I'm not picking on skeptics or believers. I'm saying, look, let's look at this, but a modern skeptical argument would probably be that, look, can you say, first of all, that that's a really huge person? And second of all, so many of these newspaper articles don't represent probably true stories. The thing is that back in the old days, especially in the 19th century, you had these daily newspapers. If somebody wasn't reading the news, they had to make up sometimes. The beat reporters would go out there and they would make up a story, a whopper as they were called, in order to drive the listenership, or the readership. Sorry, I'm a radio guy. But to try and drive the readership. And so often there was the assertion that in the old days, the old reporters of yesteryear would often come up with these whopper tales, based on liars' clubs and things like that. And maybe that's not quite so prevalent in the 20th century, but again, people say you can't believe a lot of these old newspaper articles. And when I've written articles myself about this subject, in numerous instances, the skeptical argument that someone brings to this is they say, Micah, are you really going to base your observations on these old newspaper reports when we know that we can't trust those? We can't trust those. Well, I've often brought a counter-argument that says, well, you don't have to just look at newspaper articles. I've dug up, in fact, the Bureau of Ethnology reports that Cyrus Thomas had sent to the Secretary of the Smithsonian throughout the 1890s, where they make reference to skeletons that were larger than 7 feet, which they even called the largest or among the largest that they had found. Even the Smithsonian's own research shows that, and their documentation on that research shows that during these excavations that they found these things just as well. I brought this to the attention of a gentleman, a very, very good writer and also a skeptical blogger by the name of Jason Colavito recently. And he tried to say, well, you're just making this same tired old excuse. You know, you're trying to say that there's a conspiracy and that this was a race of beings that weren't human that existed. I said, I've never said any of those things. I merely said that the Smithsonian themselves have acknowledged these recovered skeletons. And of course, what he said was, well, but still, the point is that you made it sound as though it seemed as if you were trying to make a case for conspiracy. And furthermore, you have to take into consideration that the displacement of the bones over time, due to things such as erosion, sometimes even the crystallization and enlargement of the bones over time can give the impression of larger skeletons than would have actually been recovered. This is another argument that's often brought to the table. In other words, that these bones, when they are found and discovered hundreds of years after the fact, or possibly thousands, as we saw in Santa Rosa, that they're actually larger than what they were at the time that the individual that they had belonged to passed away. In other words, we're giving ourselves a misconception that these people were larger than they actually were. But again, I have to argue that if we can look into the Smithsonian's own archives, and we see that the best scientists of the day, I don't care if it was 100 years ago or more, but the very best scientists of the day who were trained to observe and to measure and to make these measurements when they were recovering these skeletons, you mean to tell me that they were inept, or so inept, that they couldn't make these proper measurements themselves when they recovered these skeletons? You know, these weren't Albert George and Jimmy Joe going out there in the cornfield and finding these things. These were trained scientists who were recovering these skeletons. Now again, coming back to the newspaper aspect of this, people have often criticized the fact that there are the claims of very large skeletal remains that are discovered here. What we see in this story, it says, of course, that W.J. Graham, that was William Graham of the United States Court of Customs and Patent Appeals, he was a prominent amateur archaeologist. He was the man in this story who had recovered this large skull. It's known today as the Graham skull. The headline had been that June 24th, 1937, the edition of the Washington Post carried this headline: largest skull ever recorded is discovered by archaeologists in Stafford County, Virginia. This is a photograph of the Graham skull. This is kept by the Smithsonian. Again, a cohort of mine who unfortunately must go unnamed. He is in a position, he works with government. This is how he knew to look. He's as he's put it to me, he says, I like to think of myself as the Mycroft to your Mr. Holmes. Elementary, my dear Watson. So I cannot name him, and unfortunately, until he retires, he probably will have to go nameless. And this is so often the case. And another thing I'll point out to the skeptics is, when you've got people in government who are willing to go to the Smithsonian and recover their own photographs of some of these large skeletons and some of these large skeletal and skulls and remains, why is it that these people who actually can find these things, why don't they go to the skeptics and give that to them? You notice that they always come to the people who are creating the argument to the contrary. Again, I put myself kind of in the middle, but I've had people who've passed along fascinating UFO reports. I've had people who have passed along incredible stories of strange anomalous activities and things. And I always say, these people don't waste their time going to the hardened skeptics with that. And I guess there's a good reason why, huh? So here I'm showing you the Graham skull. It still remains. Now notice its estimated cranial capacity is about 2,100 cubic centimeters. This is one of the largest skulls known to exist. That's actual size right there. No, I'm kidding. But it is. But it was large. It was very large. Now, the Graham skull, now this is something interesting. I want to make an observation that ties in a little with something that you had talked about. I got 5 minutes? Oh, wow, we better move back.
Yeah, I think you better move a little faster.
Yeah. One observation I do want to make really quickly, though, is that, you know, when David, you were talking about the skulls that have been misshapen and whatnot. Now, there is a link between cranial capacity, the actual size of a skull, and of course the potential brain capacity. Many of my associates have said some of these giants may have actually been geniuses for their day. I've wondered if the malformation or the deformation of skulls isn't somehow possibly linked to that. In other words, could ancient people have learned that, well, if you actually shape a skull, potentially increasing brain capacity, could this actually improve a person's cognitive function or their brain power? I don't know. We'll go ahead and just breeze through a few of these. This is one of the smallest on record. This is an above average sized human skull, and there's the Graham skull for comparison. You can see it is quite large. This is the secession card that exists in the Smithsonian's archives. This is actually for the Graham skull. Still in their accession card catalog. Skull without face, Indian, Potomac region. Now I'm going to breeze through and show you a few others here. Smithsonian gets large Indian skull from the Aleutian Islands, Dr. Alex Herdlicka, came home with a big head, is what it says, not his own. What's interesting about this is I remember that the researcher Ivan Sanderson had often said that he had looked into a case from one of the Aleutian Islands, Shimei, I believe, in the 1940s, that a large number of, well, large skeletons that had been trepaned, holes drilled in the tops of the head had been recovered. Follow-up with that had found that the bones had been misplaced. This was another of the more famous instances where allegedly the Smithsonian had lost some of these bones. But it is interesting to note that in the accession card catalog, here we see that Herdlicka's name is actually on there. People Aleut, Haguenau Island, Alaska, in mummy caves on that area. Again, there were actually large skeletons that were recovered. I don't think that these are the ones that Sanderson was looking for, but they are probably their nearest neighbors. Look here, male adult, very large capacity, about 2,000 cc, which is almost on par with the gram skull that we saw beforehand. Again, this is in the Smithsonian accession card catalog. Here we have another. This is known as the DeHart jaw, the lower jaw of an Indian that had been recovered by Dr. W.M. DeHart, May 11th, let's see, I think it was 1911, May 1st, 1911. Here we have another large Sioux Indian skeleton. And what I love about this one, it says dimensions down here. Yeah, that was actually the Smithsonian themselves keeping this record, referring to it as such. Which I'd like to point out again, and I recognize that they will say giant to indicate large, but again, I think that the modern skeptic, they don't like the fact that giant is...
That one before just said that the guy died in 1872.
Yeah, he did actually. Yeah, look at this, by the way. Died in
1878.
Yeah, said to have been 8 feet tall. See, this is a more recent one. But they still refer to it, again, as a large person. Now, obviously, that's probably not going to be an ancient skeleton, is the thing. But it is interesting that they use this terminology, giant. And it says here also, I think, prepared by boiling. I think that this one had been, it says someplace, I looked into this one, kept at the laboratory, skull 75I skeleton. Some of this is kind of hard to read, but in a lot of these instances, with regard to where these skeletons are kept, it actually says that they're kept in the off-site storage facility for the Smithsonian rather than at the Institute. I have to move a little more quickly. This is one of the final instances we're going to look at. This was a New York Times story that refers to the recovery of large skeleton around 1890 near Castelnau, France. Now, this is a fascinating situation. This is Dr. Lapouche, who'd actually been the gentleman who had uncovered these. They weren't full skeletons in this case. Unfortunately, what we had were bone fragments. But the estimated height of the individual based on these, according to the people who analyzed this, they believed that we had an individual that could have stood taller than 10 feet. Now, I want to point out that Robert Wadlow, here's a comparison, normal humerus or human femur, and then the size comparison estimated of this individual from a Bronze Age burial site in Castelnau, France. Robert Wadlow, the tallest man known to exist in modern times, was 8'11". So if we're talking about a person who is possibly taller than 10 feet, that's a really big person. If you can't call that a giant, I don't know what you can. I don't know what you can call a giant. It's very large. A similar discovery a few years later took place at Montpellier, France. These individuals of gigantic proportions were thought to have possibly been as much as, well, actually closer to 14 or 15 feet tall, possibly. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to say this isn't me. Micah has been a gentleman who had sent along some information about this. And if you want to see this later, I can actually provide it. I know we've got to move a little more quickly here, but just to give you kind of the background, there have been a number of individuals who have actually studied this. Some of the papers still exist, and this is why I cite this as one of the better cases. A report from La Nature, volume 18, issue 888 from 1890 discusses this. There's been a professor, Paul Quinier of Montpellier School of Medicine, that had studied these. These people had felt that indeed this person had probably stood while living, their height had probably been about 3.5 meters or 11.5 feet tall. And that's probably the highest estimate for a human being in modern times, post-1880s, that has been discussed in a science paper. It's a very interesting case. Again, we'll have to breeze through some of this stuff. The final thing I want to say, this isn't a giant skeleton, but this one is on display at the Smithsonian. This is actually, and this is fascinating for people who are interested in the 14 mysteries. This is the skeleton of Grover Krantz. Anyone familiar with Grover Krantz? Grover Krantz was an anthropologist who put his career on, well, he probably endangered it more than once because he advocated belief in Bigfoot. Yeah, I didn't know his skeleton not only was in the possession of the Smithsonian, but it's on display. Did you know that? Oh, isn't that cool? This is Grover Krantz's skeleton. And the reason I bring up Grover Krantz is because I don't think that you can discuss the potential for there being very large beings in our ancient past without getting into discussion a bit of Gigantopithecus and, of course, what Grover Krantz had speculated about, which was that perhaps Gigantopithecus, a very large ape known to exist in parts of Asia, could have migrated into the United States, and this could have been an ancestor of what we might call Bigfoot today. This sounds like a very kooky subject for a lot of people. I think we're in good company here. I, for one, think that there's a very compelling case behind some of these Bigfoot reports, and so again, I think that we have to take into consideration the possibility that there may have been large hominids that existed in ancient times. We're uncertain, based on what fragments remain of Gigantopithecus, whether this was an upright walking beast or if it was a knuckle walker. Some people in Krantz had speculated that this indeed was something very large. And then finally, a couple images of Heidelberg man, which, as I pointed out in one period, of course, in South Africa, had actually gone through a stage of gigantism, 7 to 9 feet tall, had been pretty regular. Well, it looks kind of like a Bigfoot. So, and then finally we'll end with just another photograph of one of these mummies. So, I think the compelling case to be made here is that indeed there have been a variety of individuals of large stature that have existed in our past. I don't assert that these have been a separate race. Some of the records have been kept, and some of them still exist with the Smithsonian, not all of them. And I'll talk a little bit more about this over the course of the weekend, but I think the case is that, while you can dismiss them all, you can say that newspaper reports and the like are probably hoaxes. Clearly, some of them are not, and there is a case to be made for beings of large stature that have existed. Now, what were they? Well, that's beyond the scope of this conversation, and I'll leave it right there. Thank you, guys.